June 22nd, 168 BC. The plains of Pydna in northern Greece. Lucius Aemilius Paullus, consul of Rome and commander of 2 full legions, stood watching the Macedonian army deploy across the valley floor. At 60 years old, the grizzled veteran had fought in Spain, had commanded armies in Liguria, had seen every formation and tactic the Mediterranean world could offer. But what he witnessed that morning made him pause. 16,000 men moving as one, their 18-foot pikes rising like a forest of iron, the famous Macedonian Phalanx, the formation that had conquered the known world under Alexander the Great, that had crushed the armies of Persia, Egypt and India, was now arrayed against Rome. Paullus turned to his military tribune, a young officer eager for glory, and spoke words that would be recorded by the historian Plutarch. "I have seen many armies in many lands, but never have I seen anything so terrifying and beautiful as the Macedonian Phalanx in full array. If I were not a Roman, I would be afraid." The officer, confused by his commander's admission, asked if the consul doubted Rome's ability to prevail. Paullus smiled grimly. "I do not doubt Rome's victory. I fear what it will cost to achieve it. Those men across the field are not barbarians with crude weapons. They are the inheritors of Alexander's system, the most sophisticated military machine ever created. Today we will learn whether Roman iron can break Macedonian bronze, whether our flexibility can overcome their discipline, whether our way of war can defeat perfection itself." What neither Paullus nor his officers fully understood was that they were about to witness one of history's most significant military transformations. The battle that would unfold over the next 6 hours would not just decide the fate of Macedonia, it would reveal the fundamental evolution in warfare that marked the transition from the classical Greek age to Roman dominance. This is the story of how Roman legionaries first truly understood the power of the Macedonian Phalanx, and how they broke it forever. The Macedonian Phalanx was not simply a formation, it was a military revolution that had emerged from the mind of Philip II, Alexander the Great's father, in the mid-4th century BC. Before Philip, Greek warfare had been dominated by the hoplite phalanx, heavy infantry armed with 8-foot spears and large shields, fighting in close formation. It was effective but limited in scope and tactical flexibility. Philip transformed this system by introducing the sarissa, a pike of unprecedented length. At 18 feet long in its later iterations, the sarissa was a weapon that redefined infantry combat. A phalangite, as the pike-wielding soldiers were called, held the sarissa with both hands, meaning he could not carry the large hoplon shield of traditional Greek warriors. Instead, he wore a small shield strapped to his left arm, relying on armour and the protection of his comrades for defence. The genius of the sarissa was mathematical. In a traditional hoplite phalanx, only the front rank could engage the enemy with their spears. But with 18-foot pikes held at an angle, the first 5 ranks of the Macedonian phalanx could present their weapons toward the enemy simultaneously. This created an impenetrable hedge of iron points, with pike heads protruding 10 to 15 feet beyond the front rank. Any enemy attempting to close with the phalanx had to first survive, advancing through this forest of spear points, each one capable of killing at range. The formation itself was organised with ruthless efficiency. The basic unit was the syntagma, 256 men arranged in a square, 16 men wide, and 16 deep. Multiple syntagma formed larger units, and these combined to create the full phalanx. The men were trained to maintain precise spacing, close order with shields overlapping for maximum protection, or open order with more space between men for movement across broken terrain. The rear ranks were not idle reserves. They added weight to the formation, preventing the front ranks from being pushed back, replaced fallen comrades, and could lower their pikes to create additional defensive layers. The formation could present a hedge of pike points upward to defend against cavalry or missiles, or angle them downward to engage enemies below. Alexander the Great had used this formation to conquer an empire stretching from Greece to India. At the Granicus River, at Issus, at Gaugamela, the Macedonian phalanx had proven invincible. It had smashed through Persian infantry, held against cavalry charges, and anchored Alexander's combined arms tactics that included cavalry, light infantry, and siege weapons. After Alexander's death in 323 BC, his empire fragmented into successor kingdoms ruled by his generals, the Diadochi. The largest and most powerful of these was the Seleucid Empire in the east, but in Greece itself, the Antigonid dynasty ruled Macedonia and maintained Alexander's military system. For over 150 years, the Macedonian Phalanx remained the dominant infantry formation in the eastern Mediterranean. It had defeated Gallic invasions, crushed rival Greek city-states, and maintained Macedonian supremacy in the Balkans. By 168 BC, the Kingdom of Macedonia was ruled by Perseus, the last of the Antigonid kings. A capable but cautious monarch, Perseus had inherited a kingdom under pressure from the rising power of Rome. The Romans, who had started as a single city-state on the Italian peninsula, had expanded relentlessly over the past 2 centuries. They had conquered Italy, defeated Carthage in 2 brutal wars, and were now the dominant military power in the western Mediterranean. Roman expansion inevitably brought them into conflict with the Hellenistic kingdoms of the East. In 200 BC, Rome had fought its first war against Macedonia, defeating Philip V, Perseus' father, in a series of campaigns that demonstrated Roman military capability. The decisive battle at Cynocephalae in 197 BC had shown that Roman legions could defeat the Macedonian phalanx under certain conditions, but the battle had been fought on broken terrain that disrupted the phalanx's cohesion. Many Greek military theorists argued that Cynocephalae was not a fair test. The phalanx had been caught on rough ground, unable to maintain formation. On level terrain, they insisted, the phalanx remained invincible. Perseus believed this. When renewed conflict with Rome erupted in 171 BC, the Macedonian king was confident that his army, properly deployed on ground of his choosing, could defeat the Roman legions. The Third Macedonian War that followed was a cautious affair. Perseus was not a bold commander. He avoided major engagements, manoeuvred defensively, and tried to exhaust the Romans through attrition. For 3 years, he successfully frustrated Roman attempts to bring him to battle on unfavourable terms. Rome sent consul after consul, army after army, and Perseus evaded or repulsed them all. The Roman Senate, growing frustrated with the war's lack of progress, finally turned to one of their most experienced commanders. Lucius Aemilius Paullus was from an old patrician family with a distinguished military record. He had commanded armies in Spain and Liguria, served as consul, and earned a reputation as a careful, methodical commander who prepared thoroughly and struck decisively. At 60 years old, he was past his physical prime, but at the height of his intellectual powers. He understood that defeating Perseus required not just military force, but psychological pressure and strategic patience. Paullus arrived in Greece in 168 BC with reinforcements and a plan. He understood that Perseus's strategy of evasion only worked if the Macedonian king could maintain his army's morale and supplies. Paullus set about cutting Perseus's supply lines, threatening his bases and forcing him into an increasingly untenable position. The Romans advanced into Macedonia itself, moving along the coast toward Perseus's strongholds. Perseus, recognizing that continued evasion would eventually lead to the collapse of his kingdom through economic exhaustion, decided he must fight. He chose his ground carefully. The coastal plain near the city of Pydna offered ideal terrain for the phalanx, level ground with few obstacles where his formation could deploy to maximum effect. Perseus positioned his army with the sea to his right, mountains to his left, limiting Roman ability to outflank him. His centre was the Great Phalanx, 16,000 phalangites in full array, the largest concentration of pike-armed infantry assembled in a generation. On the wings were lighter infantry, Thracian and Greek mercenaries, and cavalry. Perseus's battle plan was simple and had been proven effective for 150 years. The phalanx would advance in the centre, its wall of pike points irresistible. The Romans would be forced to retreat or be impaled. Once the Roman centre was engaged and pinned, the cavalry would strike the flanks, and the lighter infantry would exploit any gaps. It was Alexander's system, time-tested and perfected over generations of warfare. Paullus, observing the Macedonian deployment, understood immediately that he faced the phalanx at its most dangerous. The terrain was perfect for Perseus. The formation was properly arrayed with adequate spacing and clear fields of advance. The Macedonian troops were well-trained professionals, many from families that had served in the phalanx for generations. This was not going to be another Cynocephalae where terrain disrupted the enemy formation. This would be a direct test of systems, legion against phalanx, Roman flexibility against Macedonian discipline. The Roman legion of 168 BC was a very different formation from the Macedonian Phalanx. It had evolved over centuries of warfare in Italy, fighting in the hills and mountains of the peninsula where rigid formations were a liability. The legion was built around flexibility, adaptability, and individual initiative. A Roman legionary carried a gladius, a short sword designed for stabbing, and 2 pila, weighted javelins that could be thrown before close combat. He wore mail armour, or a bronze cuirass, carried a large rectangular shield called a scutum, and was trained to fight in loose formation where individual skill mattered. The legion was organised very differently from the phalanx. Instead of one massive block, it was divided into smaller units called maniples, each about 120 men. These maniples were arranged in a checkerboard pattern called the quincunx, with gaps between units. The first line, the astati, were younger soldiers. Behind them came the principes, men in their prime. The third line, the triarii, were veterans who served as a final reserve. This organisation allowed remarkable tactical flexibility. Maniples could advance or retreat independently, wheel to face threats from the flanks, open lanes to allow other units through, or contract to form a solid line. If the front line was exhausted or overwhelmed, it could fall back through the gaps while the second line advanced to replace them. The Roman legion could adapt to terrain, respond to unexpected threats, and maintain cohesion even after suffering casualties that would have broken a rigid phalanx formation. Roman tactics emphasized aggressive close combat. The pillar were thrown at close range to disrupt enemy formations and disable shields, the heavy iron shank bending on impact to prevent the enemy from throwing them back. Then the legionaries closed with their swords, using their large shields to create individual protection while stabbing with the gladius. This required courage and training, but it gave Roman soldiers flexibility that pike-armed phalangites lacked. A legionary could fight effectively in broken terrain, in narrow spaces, even one-on-one. A phalangite was only fully effective as part of his formation. On the morning of June 22nd, the two armies faced each other across the plain of Pydna. Roman sources, particularly Plutarch and Livy, provide detailed accounts of what followed, and while we must be cautious about their Roman bias, the broad outline of the battle is clear. Neither commander wanted to be the first to attack. Perseus held strong ground and saw no reason to advance prematurely. Paullus, having observed the perfect deployment of the phalanx, recognized that attacking it head-on across level ground would be suicidal. The two armies stood in formation throughout the morning, neither willing to commit first. Then, around noon, an accident triggered the battle. A pack horse carrying supplies for the Roman camp broke loose and ran toward the river that separated the armies. Roman soldiers ran after it, and Thracian troops on the Macedonian left moved to intercept them. What began as a minor skirmish over a runaway horse escalated rapidly. More troops from both sides rushed to support their comrades. Within minutes, fighting had spread along the entire line. Perseus, seeing Roman units advancing piecemeal and in disorder, gave the order for a general advance. The Macedonian phalanx, 16,000 strong, began to move forward. What the Romans saw must have been truly terrifying. The phalanx advanced in perfect order, a solid wall of men with a forest of pike points projecting forward. The sarissas of the first 5 ranks created a hedge of iron 15 feet deep. The rear ranks held their pikes vertically, creating the appearance of a mobile forest. The formation moved slowly but inexorably, maintaining perfect alignment. As the phalanx advanced, the Macedonians raised their war cry, the traditional Greek paean. 16,000 voices roaring in unison, combined with the rhythmic crash of pike butts striking the ground in time with their march, created a psychological weapon as formidable as the physical one. The sound was said to be audible miles away. Roman troops in the front line, seeing this approaching wall of death, began to waver. These were not inexperienced soldiers. Many had fought in Spain or against the Gauls, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for the Macedonian phalanx in full advance on level ground. The pike points seemed impossible to avoid, the formation impossible to break. Some units began to fall back without engaging. Others tried to throw their pila at the advancing phalanx, but found the range too great for effective impact. Paullus, watching from a small rise behind his lines, saw his worst fears being realized. The phalanx was functioning exactly as designed. Roman units that tried to close with it were stopped by the wall of pike points. Men were impaled before they could get within sword range. The large Roman shields that protected so effectively against swords and javelins were useless against 18-foot pikes that struck from beyond shield reach. The Roman front line began to collapse. Units that had advanced to skirmish with Macedonian light troops found themselves facing the full weight of the phalanx and were driven back. The Macedonians, sensing victory, pressed their advantage. The phalanx continued its steady advance, pushing the Romans back across the plain. At this moment, Lucius Aemilius Paullus experienced what every Roman commander feared, the possibility of total defeat. Later sources record that he was so distressed by what he was witnessing that he tore his tunic in frustration. His carefully planned campaign was unravelling before his eyes. The invincible reputation of the Macedonian Phalanx, built over 150 years of warfare, seemed fully justified. But Paullus was an experienced enough commander to recognise something crucial. The Phalanx, while seemingly invincible on level ground, was advancing too successfully. Perseus' troops, excited by their initial success and eager to complete the route of the Romans, began to increase their pace. The formation that had advanced in perfect order began to lose cohesion. The plain of Pydna, while generally level, was not perfectly flat. There were small gullies, rises in the ground, rocky patches, areas of softer soil. On the march across this terrain, the unified phalanx began to develop gaps. Units advancing faster than others pulled ahead. Sections that encountered obstacles slowed, while those on clearer ground continued forward. The single massive formation began to fragment into smaller blocks, separated by increasing distances. This was the fundamental weakness of the phalanx, a weakness that no amount of training or discipline could fully overcome. The formation's strength depended on maintaining perfect alignment. The sarissas had to present a unified front. Gaps in the line were fatal vulnerabilities because the phalanx had no flexibility to respond. A phalangite could only effectively fight to his front, in formation, with the protection of his comrades on either side. A Roman legionary in his maniple could turn, could fight individually if necessary, could respond to threats from multiple directions. The phalangite, with his 18-foot pike held in both hands and minimal armour, was helpless if attacked from the side or rear. Paullus saw the gaps forming. With the tactical insight that marked Rome's best commanders, he immediately recognised the opportunity. Instead of trying to break through the phalanx's front, which remained formidable even in its fragmented state, he would strike at the gaps between units. The order went out along the Roman line. Maniples were to identify gaps in the Macedonian formation and exploit them. Do not engage the phalanx frontally. Strike at the spaces between units, attack from the flanks, get inside their pike reach, where the sarissa becomes a liability rather than an asset. The Roman maniple system, so often criticised by Greek military theorists as less disciplined than the phalanx, now proved its worth. Individual maniples, operating with tactical independence, began to manoeuvre toward the gaps in the Macedonian line. These were experienced troops, many veterans of previous campaigns, and they understood instantly what their commanders were ordering. As the phalanx continued to press forward, confident in their advance, Roman maniples began to flow into the spaces between Macedonian units like water finding cracks in stone. Once inside pike reach, the advantages of the phalanx evaporated instantly. The sarissa, so formidable at range, became a fatal liability in close combat. The weapon was too long and unwieldy to be used effectively at sword distance. A phalangite attacked from the side or rear by a Roman legionary armed with a gladius and protected by a large shield had almost no chance. He could not bring his pike to bear. His small shield was inadequate protection, and he lacked the training or equipment for individual close combat. The first Macedonian units to be infiltrated and attacked from the flanks collapsed rapidly. The Romans, using their swords with brutal efficiency, cut into the phalanx from the sides and rear. Macedonian soldiers, trained to fight only as part of a rigid formation, found themselves in a type of combat for which they had no preparation. Panic began to spread. As Macedonian units on the flanks of the gaps were destroyed, the gaps widened. More Roman maniples pressed forward, exploiting the increasing disorder. The Macedonian phalanx, so dominant when advancing in unison, was now fragmented into isolated blocks with Romans attacking between and around them. The genius of Perseus's inherited formation, its irresistible frontal assault, became its doom. Those Macedonian units still advancing and maintaining formation found themselves increasingly isolated as units to their left and right were engaged from the flanks and destroyed. The Roman tactical system, designed for exactly this kind of fluid combat, allowed maniples to support each other, to concentrate against isolated enemy units, to maintain pressure from multiple directions. Plutarch records the critical moment when Paullus himself, observing the turning tide of battle, rode forward to witness the destruction of the phalanx up close. He was said to have marvelled at the efficiency of Roman tactics once the formation was broken. Macedonian soldiers, individually brave and well trained within their system, were helpless against Roman legionaries in close combat. The gladius, short and deadly, was the perfect weapon for the butcher's work now underway. The psychological collapse of the Macedonian army followed swiftly. The phalanx depended not just on physical formation, but on collective confidence. Each man's courage was sustained by the protection of his comrades and the demonstrated invincibility of the formation. Once that invincibility was shattered, once men saw their formation breaking and comrades being cut down from the flanks, panic spread like wildfire. Individual Macedonian soldiers began to break and run. This was fatal. A phalangite who abandoned his position in formation was defenceless. His pike was useless for anything but fighting from within the formation. His small shield provided minimal protection. His armour, lighter than Roman equipment, was insufficient against pursuing enemies. Roman cavalry and light infantry, which had been held in reserve or kept to the flanks during the main engagement, now swept forward to pursue the breaking Macedonian units. What had been a battle became a massacre. The statistics recorded by ancient sources are grim, though we must treat specific numbers with caution. Livy records that 20,000 Macedonians were killed and 11,000 captured. Perseus himself fled the battlefield with his cavalry, abandoning his infantry to their fate. The king who had so carefully chosen his ground and deployed his army in the traditional formation that had conquered the world under Alexander, now watched his kingdom's military power disintegrate in a single afternoon. The Macedonian phalanx, unbroken since its creation 200 years earlier, had been comprehensively destroyed. The most significant aspect of the battle was not the victory itself, but what the Romans learned. Paullus and his officers had entered the battle uncertain whether they could break the phalanx on level ground. They had won at Cynoscephaly, but that victory had been attributed to terrain advantage. Pydna had demonstrated that Roman tactical flexibility could defeat Macedonian rigidity, even under ideal conditions for the phalanx. The lesson was clear. The phalanx was indeed formidable when properly deployed on suitable terrain. Its frontal assault was as devastating as its reputation suggested. Roman soldiers had experienced firsthand the terror of facing that wall of pike points, the seeming impossibility of closing with an enemy whose weapons held you at distance. But the Romans had also learned the phalanx's fatal weakness. It could not maintain perfect cohesion during extended movement. It could not adapt to terrain variation. It could not fight effectively once its formation was disrupted, and most critically it lacked the tactical flexibility to respond to an adaptive enemy who refused to fight on its terms. The years following Pydna saw Roman military writers and historians analyse the battle and the Macedonian system in detail. Polybius, a Greek historian who lived in Rome and witnessed Roman military practices firsthand, wrote extensively about the differences between legion and phalanx. His analysis, preserved in his histories, provides the most sophisticated contemporary understanding of why Rome's system proved superior. Polybius identified the key factors. First, terrain. The phalanx required level ground free of obstacles. Such terrain was rare in the varied geography of the Mediterranean. The legion, by contrast, could fight effectively on hills, in forests, in cities, across broken ground. Second, tactical flexibility. The phalanx was all or nothing. It won by maintaining formation and pressing forward, or it was destroyed. The legion could adapt, could retreat and reform, could respond to flanking attacks, could fight in any direction. Third, sustainability in combat. The phalanx was optimized for a single decisive clash. If that clash failed to break the enemy, the formation had no secondary tactics to fall back on. The legion, with its three-line system and independent maniples, could sustain combat for extended periods, rotating fresh troops forward as others tired. Fourth, individual capability. A legionary was trained to fight as part of a unit but could also function independently if necessary. A phalangite was effective only within his formation. Once isolated, he was helpless. Polybius concluded that while the phalanx was theoretically perfect, requiring perfect conditions to function, the legion was practically superior because it worked effectively under imperfect conditions, which described virtually all real combat situations. The Romans themselves drew similar conclusions. In the decades after Pydna, Roman military doctrine codified the lessons learned. Future Roman commanders facing pike-armed opponents, whether Hellenistic armies or other groups that adopted similar systems, applied the Pydna template. Refused to engage the phalanx frontally on level ground, use light troops and cavalry to harass and disrupt formation, maneuver to force the phalanx to advance over broken ground, strike at gaps and flanks once cohesion was lost. This doctrine proved consistently successful. The Battle of Pydna marked more than just a Roman victory over Macedonia. It represented the definitive shift in military supremacy from the Hellenistic world to Rome. The Macedonian kingdom was destroyed, its territory divided and ultimately annexed as a Roman province. The other Hellenistic kingdoms, watching Macedonia's defeat, understood that Roman military power was now unassailable. The Seleucid Empire, still powerful in Asia, never again seriously challenged Rome. The Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt became increasingly dependent on Roman support for survival. Within 100 years, all the successor kingdoms of Alexander's empire had become Roman provinces or client states. The psychological impact was as significant as the military result. For 200 years, the Hellenistic world had viewed the Macedonian Phalanx as the ultimate expression of military power. Alexander had conquered the world with it. The successor kingdoms had maintained their independence through it. The formation was not just a military system, but a symbol of Greek martial superiority. Pydna shattered that illusion. The best that Greek military science could offer had been broken by a Roman system that seemed less elegant, less sophisticated, less perfect. But the Romans had understood something the Greeks had not. War was not a contest of perfect systems in ideal conditions. It was chaos, uncertainty, broken terrain, and imperfect information. The military organization that could function effectively under imperfect conditions would always defeat the one that required perfection. The maniple system with its tactical flexibility, the gladius designed for close-quarters fighting, the emphasis on individual initiative within unit structure, all reflected Roman pragmatism over Greek theoretical perfection. The Romans had built their military system through centuries of warfare in Italy's hills and mountains. They had fought Samnites in forests, Gauls in broken terrain, Carthaginians in Spain's rough country. Their system had evolved to handle real-world combat conditions, not theoretical ideal battles on perfectly level plains. When they met the phalanx, a system optimized for those theoretical conditions, Roman practical experience defeated Greek theoretical perfection. The human dimension of Pydna is worth considering. For the Macedonian soldiers, many from families that had served in the phalanx for generations, the defeat must have been psychologically devastating. They had been raised on stories of Alexander's conquests, of the phalanx's invincibility, of Macedonian martial superiority. They had trained in the system their fathers and grandfathers had used. They had believed absolutely in the formation's power. To see that formation broken, to experience its vulnerabilities firsthand, to watch their comrades being cut down once the Romans got inside pike reach, must have shattered their understanding of warfare itself. The survivors, those 11,000 who were captured rather than killed, carried that knowledge back to the Greek world. The phalanx could be beaten. The system that had seemed invincible for 2 centuries had been comprehensively defeated. For the Romans, Pydna provided critical validation. They had faced the legendary Macedonian phalanx on ground favourable to the enemy, and they had destroyed it. Any lingering questions about Roman military effectiveness against Hellenistic armies were answered. The confidence gained at Pydna would fuel Roman expansion for the next century. When Caesar faced pike-armed Germans, when Pompey encountered Pontic armies using Hellenistic systems, when Roman legions met any formation that relied on long spears and massed formations, they applied the lessons learned at Pydna with consistent success. Lucius Aemilius Paullus returned to Rome to celebrate a triumph, the grandest honour the Republic could bestow. The captured Macedonian treasures paraded through Rome's streets included Perseus himself, the defeated king displayed in chains. The triumph lasted 3 days, with the accumulated wealth of Macedonia distributed to Roman soldiers and citizens. Paullus's prestige was immense, having destroyed a kingdom and ended a dynasty that stretched back to Alexander's generals. But his most significant contribution was not the wealth or territory gained. It was the tactical knowledge proven at Pydna. The Roman legion, the system that would dominate Mediterranean warfare for the next 600 years, had been tested against. The best the Hellenistic world could offer, and had proven superior. The Macedonian Phalanx did not completely disappear after Pydna. Some Hellenistic armies continued to use pike-armed infantry for another century. The Seleucid Empire maintained phalanx units into the 1st century BC. When Rome encountered these formations in later wars, they applied the Pydna template with consistent success. At the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC, fought before Pydna, Romans had already demonstrated they could defeat Seleucid pike phalanxes using similar tactics. At Tigranocerta in 69 BC, Lucullus's legions destroyed an Armenian army that included phalanx units. In each case, the pattern was the same: refuse frontal engagement, force movement over broken ground, exploit gaps in formation, strike at flanks and rear with maniples. The theoretical superiority of the phalanx meant nothing against an enemy who understood its practical weaknesses. The evolution of Roman military thinking after Pydna is evident in later military writings. When Marius reformed the legions in 107 BC, making them more uniform and professional, he built on the tactical lessons learned against the phalanx. The new legion maintained the flexibility that had proven decisive at Pydna while improving organisation and equipment. When Caesar described his battles in Gaul, he emphasised the same principles: flexibility, initiative by junior officers, tactical adaptation to terrain and circumstances. The Roman military system reached its peak effectiveness in the 1st century BC, and that effectiveness was built on foundations laid at Pydna. By the imperial period, when Rome faced primarily barbarian armies rather than sophisticated Hellenistic forces, the legion had evolved further, but the core principles remained: flexibility over rigidity, adaptation over perfection, practical effectiveness over theoretical superiority. These principles, proven against the Macedonian phalanx, would sustain Roman military dominance for centuries. Modern military historians analysing Pydna have noted its significance as a case study in how tactical systems succeed or fail. The phalanx represented an optimization for specific conditions: maximum combat power in a frontal assault on level ground. The legion represented optimization for general conditions, reasonable effectiveness across a wide range of situations. In any specific ideal condition, a specialized system may outperform a generalized one. The phalanx on perfectly level ground was probably superior to the legion in direct frontal combat, but war rarely provides ideal conditions. Terrain is broken, circumstances are unexpected, enemies adapt. The military system that functions effectively across varied conditions will consistently defeat the one that requires specific conditions to function optimally. This lesson has been relearned throughout military history. Highly specialized weapons or tactics that seem invincible under specific conditions prove vulnerable when circumstances change. The Roman legion's success came from accepting good enough performance across all situations, rather than seeking perfect performance in ideal situations. The Macedonian phalanx's failure came from optimizing so completely for ideal conditions that it became vulnerable whenever those conditions were not met. The Battle of Pydna, on June 22nd, 168 BC, lasted approximately 6 hours from the initial skirmish to the final pursuit of fleeing Macedonians. In those 6 hours, the military balance of the ancient world shifted decisively. The Hellenistic age, built on the foundation of Alexander's conquests and sustained by the power of the Macedonian Phalanx, ended. The Roman age, which would dominate the Mediterranean and European world for the next 600 years, began its ascent to unchallenged supremacy. When Lucius Aemilius Paullus stood on the battlefield at day's end, surveying the destruction of the Macedonian army, he understood the historical significance of what had occurred. The formation that had conquered the known world, that had seemed invincible for 2 centuries, had been broken. Not through superior individual courage or better weapons or divine favour, but through a tactical system better adapted to the realities of warfare. The Romans had not invented a new weapon or discovered a secret. They had simply built a military organisation that worked effectively under imperfect conditions, and that practical superiority had proven decisive. The last Macedonian phalanx units disappeared from history within a generation of Pydna. Some were disbanded, Some were reformed into auxiliary units using Roman equipment and tactics. Some simply faded away as the kingdom that sustained them was absorbed into the Roman Empire. The sarissa, that revolutionary 18-foot pike that had transformed infantry warfare in the 4th century BC, became a historical curiosity rather than a weapon of war. But the lessons learned in the battle survived. Roman military doctrine, built on the foundation laid at Pydna, would influence European military thought for millennia. The emphasis on tactical flexibility, on adaptable formations, on training soldiers to operate independently when necessary while functioning as units when possible, became fundamental principles of Western military tradition. Modern armies still emphasize these principles. Today, on the plain of Pydna, there is little to mark what occurred there over 2,000 years ago. The ancient sources provide no precise location for the battle, only general descriptions of the area. Archaeological evidence is limited. The grand armies that clashed there left no permanent trace on the landscape, but the tactical principles tested there, the demonstration that flexibility defeats rigidity, that practical effectiveness trumps theoretical perfection, that a military system must be designed for real-world conditions rather than idealized scenarios. Those lessons remain relevant to anyone who studies warfare or tactics or organizational effectiveness. When Lucius Aemilius Paullus said he'd never seen anything so terrifying and beautiful as the Macedonian Phalanx in full array, he was expressing genuine admiration for a military system that represented the peak of classical Greek military science. The Phalanx was indeed beautiful, elegant, sophisticated, theoretically perfect, and on that June day in 168 BC, Roman legionaries learned firsthand just how powerful it was. They also learned how to break it. That knowledge, bought with Roman blood on the plains of Pydna, would echo through the centuries as Rome rose to become history's most successful military empire. The thunder of the Phalanx's advance, 16,000 men moving as one with their 18-foot pikes creating a forest of iron, was heard for the last time that day. The clash of Roman gladi cutting into disrupted Macedonian formations announced a new era. The age of Alexander had ended. The age of Rome had begun. The strategic implications of Pydna rippled outward from that blood-soaked plain in ways that contemporaries could scarcely have imagined. Within the Roman command structure, the battle sparked intense debate about the nature of military superiority and what exactly had been proven on that June afternoon. The younger officers, those military tribunes who had watched the Phalanx advance and then witnessed its destruction, drew different conclusions than their commander. Many believed they had witnessed Roman individual superiority over Greek discipline. They argued that Roman courage and fighting spirit had overcome Macedonian rigidity, and that any Roman legionary was worth 2 or 3 phalangites in close combat. This interpretation, flattering to Roman martial pride, missed the deeper tactical lessons that Paullus and more experienced commanders understood. The battle had not been won by superior individual prowess. It had been won by superior tactical organization. The Roman system allowed exploitation of enemy weaknesses. The Macedonian system did not. Polybius, writing his histories in the decades after Pydna, devoted extensive analysis to this question, because he recognized that misunderstanding the reasons for victory was almost as dangerous as defeat itself. He emphasized repeatedly that the Phalanx had not been defeated by better warriors, but by a better system of warfare. A phalangite, he argued, was individually as brave and capable as any Roman legionary. The difference lay in what their respective formations allowed them to do. The Phalanx made men into components of a machine, individually replaceable parts of a greater whole. The legion made men into soldiers who functioned best as part of a unit, but retained individual capability when circumstances required it. This distinction was not merely philosophical. It had profound implications for training, equipment, tactics, and ultimately for which system would prove dominant in the long run. The Hellenistic kingdoms watching Macedonia's destruction understood that something fundamental had changed. Antiochus IV of Epiphanes, ruling the Seleucid Empire from Syria, received reports of Pydna with alarm. His kingdom maintained substantial phalanx forces, trained in the Macedonian tradition and equipped with the sarissa. The Seleucid military establishment had invested generations in perfecting this system. Now they were being told it was obsolete. The debates within the Seleucid court revealed the intellectual difficulty of abandoning a proven system. The Phalanx had, after all, won countless battles over 2 centuries. Alexander had conquered an empire with it. The Diadochi had maintained their kingdoms through it. To admit that Roman tactical flexibility was superior meant acknowledging that Greek military science, which had produced the most sophisticated tactical thinking in the ancient world, had been surpassed by what Greeks viewed as Roman pragmatic barbarity. The Greeks had created military theory as a discipline. They had written treatises on tactics, had developed mathematical models for optimal formation density, had calculated the ideal pike length based on ergonomic studies and reach calculations. The sarissa was not an arbitrary length. It was precisely calculated to maximize reach, while remaining manageable by a soldier of average height and strength. The phalanx spacing, whether close order or open order, was derived from extensive battlefield experience and theoretical analysis. This system had been refined through generations of warfare and study. The Romans, by contrast, had no military theory to speak of. They had practical manuals on training and organization, but nothing approaching the sophisticated tactical literature of the Greek world. Roman military effectiveness came not from theoretical analysis but from empirical experience. They tried things, kept what worked, discarded what did not, and built their system through iteration rather than deduction. The clash at Pydna was therefore not just a battle between two armies. It was a contest between two fundamentally different approaches to warfare: theoretical optimization versus practical adaptation, specialized perfection versus general effectiveness, and practical adaptation had won decisively. For the Seleucid military establishment, this created an existential crisis. Should they abandon generations of accumulated knowledge and experience? Should they discard a system that had proven effective in their own regional conflicts? Or should they attempt to modify the phalanx to address its revealed weaknesses? Antiochus Thorf chose a middle path. He maintained the phalanx as the core of his army, but attempted to make it more flexible. He experimented with lighter pikes that would be more maneuverable in close combat. He trained units to fight in smaller formations that could respond more independently. He incorporated more light infantry and cavalry to protect the phalanx flanks and exploit gaps in enemy formations. These reforms showed sophistication and tactical understanding, but they also revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what had made the Roman system superior. The Roman legion was not simply a modified phalanx, it was a completely different conceptual approach to infantry warfare. You could not create a flexible phalanx, because flexibility and the phalanx were contradictory concepts. The phalanx's power came from its rigidity, its mass, its unified weight pressing forward behind a wall of pike points. Any modification that made it more flexible necessarily reduced its core effectiveness. The Romans, meanwhile, were learning a different lesson from Pydna. The battle had demonstrated that their system could defeat any infantry formation when properly employed. But it had also revealed areas where Roman capabilities were lacking. The Macedonian cavalry, while ultimately defeated, had been superior in quality and equipment to Roman horsemen. The Macedonian light infantry had shown greater mobility and range than Roman velites. Most significantly, the Romans recognized that they had been fortunate in the terrain at Pydna. The plain had been level enough for the phalanx to deploy, but broken enough to disrupt its cohesion during the advance. What if they had faced the phalanx on truly ideal terrain, a perfectly level field with no obstacles? Would the same tactics have worked? These questions drove Roman military innovation in the decades after Pydna. The legion system was refined and standardized. Equipment was improved. Training became more sophisticated. Most importantly, Roman commanders studied the battle and developed doctrine for facing similar formations in the future. When Gaius Marius reformed the legions in 107 BC, creating the professional army that would dominate for the next 2 centuries, many of his innovations reflected lessons traced back to Pydna. The elimination of the 3-line maniple system in favor of cohorts reflected a need for units large enough to have tactical impact but small enough to maneuver independently. The standardization of equipment ensured every legionary could fight effectively in close combat. The emphasis on engineering and fortification gave legions the ability to fight from prepared positions rather than always meeting the enemy in open battle. All of these reforms built on the understanding that Roman superiority came from systematic advantages, not individual heroism. The Pydna experience also influenced Roman attitudes toward military professionalism. The Macedonian Phalanx had been manned by professional soldiers, many from families with generations of military service. The Romans in 168 BC still relied largely on citizen levies, men who served for a campaign season and then returned to their farms. Yet these citizen soldiers had defeated the professionals. This reinforced Roman belief in the superiority of their citizen soldier model. A free Roman fighting for his state was worth more than a professional mercenary fighting for pay. This ideology would sustain Roman military effectiveness for another century until changing strategic circumstances required the shift to professional legions that Marius would implement. The tactical analysis of Pydna became a standard part of Roman military education. Young officers were taught the battle as a case study in how to defeat pike-armed formations. The key principles were codified into doctrine that would be applied whenever Rome faced similar enemies. First, avoid engaging the phalanx frontally when it is properly formed on suitable terrain. The initial Roman experience at Pydna, when the advancing phalanx drove back the legions, demonstrated that direct frontal assault against a properly deployed pike formation was futile. The pike points created a zone of death that Roman shields and armour could not penetrate. Any commander who ordered his men to charge directly into the levelled sarissas of a formed phalanx was sending them to slaughter. Second, force the phalanx to move. A stationary phalanx on chosen ground was at maximum effectiveness, but movement over any distance inevitably created gaps and disrupted cohesion. Roman forces should manoeuvre to threaten the enemy's flanks or rear, forcing the phalanx to advance or reposition. Use light troops to harass and provoke. Create threats that the phalanx commander could not ignore. Once the formation was moving, its vulnerabilities would manifest. Third, exploit terrain. Even on generally level ground, small variations in elevation, patches of rough ground, gullies, streams, any terrain features that disrupted the phalanx's spacing should be identified and utilized. Roman forces should position themselves to force the phalanx to advance across such obstacles. If no natural terrain features existed, create them. Dig ditches, scatter obstacles, use any engineering capability to disrupt the ground over which the phalanx must advance. Fourth, strike at the gaps. Once the phalanx formation broke into separate blocks, Roman maniples should flow into the gaps. Do not engage the still-formed portions frontally. Instead, attack the flanks and rear of isolated units. Once inside pike reach, the gladius and scutum gave Roman legionaries overwhelming advantage. The phalangite with his sarissa held in both hands and minimal armour was nearly helpless against a swordsman at close quarters. Fifth, maintain pressure. Even after initial penetration of the phalanx line, the battle was not won. Isolated phalanx units could reform or be rallied by their commanders. Roman forces must maintain constant pressure, preventing enemy reorganization, exploiting success, and driving broken units into complete rout. This required discipline and coordinated maniple action, qualities that Roman training emphasized. These principles, proven at Pydna, would be applied successfully by Roman commanders for generations. When Lucullus faced Tigranes of Armenia in 69 BC, he used precisely this template to defeat a much larger army that included substantial phalanx forces. When Caesar described fighting against pike-armed German tribes in Gaul, his tactical approach reflected the same principles. The Battle of Pydna had provided Rome with a systematic method for defeating what had seemed an invincible formation. The human cost of Pydna extended far beyond the 20,000 Macedonians killed on the battlefield. The destruction of Macedonia as an independent kingdom meant the end of a political entity that had existed for 500 years. The Antigonid dynasty, which had ruled since the Wars of the Diadochi, was extinct. Perseus, paraded through Rome in chains, would die in captivity. His children were taken as hostages, ensuring no revival of the royal line. The kingdom itself was initially divided into 4 republics under Roman supervision, a system designed to prevent any unified Macedonian resistance. Within 20 years, even this limited autonomy was ended. Macedonia became a Roman province, its government directly administered by Roman officials, its resources exploited for Roman benefit, its people subject to Roman taxation. The psychological impact on the Greek world was profound. Macedonia had been the last major Greek state to maintain genuine independence from Rome. The cities of mainland Greece had long since become Roman clients or subjects. The island states were Roman allies in name but subjects in practice. Now Macedonia, the kingdom that had produced Alexander and conquered the known world, had been crushed. For Greeks who had maintained hope that Hellenistic civilization might resist Roman expansion, Pydna was the death of that dream. The battle became a symbol in Greek historical memory of the transition from the Hellenistic age to the Roman age. Writers like Polybius, himself a Greek who lived through this transition, saw Pydna as marking a decisive historical shift. The world that had been shaped by Alexander's conquests, where Greek culture and military power had dominated from the Mediterranean to India, was now being replaced by a Roman world where Greek culture survived but Greek political power was extinct. The philosophical response among Greek intellectuals was complex. Some argued that Greek military defeat reflected moral decline, that the Greeks had become too sophisticated, too philosophical, too removed from the martial virtues that had made Alexander great. The Macedonians had maintained the old ways, they argued, but even they had succumbed to luxury and complacency. Rome's victory represented the triumph of primitive virtue over decadent civilization. This interpretation, while flattering to Roman ears, was more about Greek self-criticism than accurate analysis. Others recognized that the defeat was tactical and organizational, not moral. The Roman system was simply better adapted to the realities of contemporary warfare. This recognition, while painful to Greek pride, at least offered a path forward. If Rome had won through superior organization, Greeks could adopt Roman methods. Indeed, Greek military writers in the Roman period would analyze Roman tactical systems extensively, contributing to the theoretical understanding of what had made Rome successful. The economic consequences of Pydna transformed the Mediterranean world. The wealth of Macedonia, accumulated over generations and enhanced by control of the region's gold and silver mines, flowed to Rome as war spoils. The immediate plunder was staggering. Livy records that Paullus's triumph included wagon after wagon of Macedonian treasure, artistic works, royal regalia, and captured weapons. The long-term economic impact was even more significant. The Macedonian mines, which had financed Philip II's military reforms and Alexander's conquests, now enriched Rome. The tax revenue from the new province flowed to the Roman treasury. The trade routes that had connected Macedonia to both the Greek south and the Thracian north fell under Roman control. This wealth fueled Roman expansion for the next century. The influx of Macedonian treasure, combined with the earlier spoils from Carthage and the ongoing exploitation of Spain's mineral wealth, gave Rome resources unprecedented in the ancient world. The city's population exploded. Public building projects transformed Rome from a provincial capital to a great metropolis. The Roman elite, enriched by war spoils and provincial administration, became patrons of Greek art and culture on a massive scale. Paradoxically, Rome's military victory over the Greek world led to Greek cultural victory over Rome. The flood of Greek artworks, books, philosophers and teachers that poured into Rome after Pydna Hellenized Roman culture profoundly. The Roman upper classes learned Greek, studied Greek philosophy, collected Greek art, and employed Greek tutors for their children. Roman literature, which had been unsophisticated before the Punic Wars, was transformed by Greek models. This cultural Hellenization created tension within Roman society. Conservative elements, represented by figures like Cato the Elder, warned that Greek sophistication was corrupting Roman virtue. They pointed to the fate of Macedonia itself, defeated despite its glorious past, as evidence that Greek culture led to military weakness. These conservatives argued for maintaining pure Roman traditions, rejecting Greek luxury and philosophy, and preserving the harsh martial virtues that had made Rome great. The opposing faction, represented by the Scipio family and others, embraced Greek culture while maintaining Roman political and military superiority. They argued that Rome could adopt the best of Greek civilization while avoiding its weaknesses. Military victory at Pydna had proven Roman superiority in war. Now Rome should prove its superiority in peace by creating a synthesis of Roman power and Greek culture. This debate, sparked in part by Rome's encounter with the Hellenistic world and crystallized by Pydna, would shape Roman culture for centuries. The resolution was essentially the position of the Hellenophile faction. Rome adopted Greek culture wholesale in areas like literature, philosophy, art, and architecture, while maintaining distinctly Roman approaches to law, government, and military affairs. The result was Greco-Roman civilization, the cultural synthesis that would dominate the Mediterranean world for 700 years and provide the foundation for European civilization. In this sense, Pydna's impact extended far beyond military tactics. The battle that destroyed Macedonian political power paradoxically enabled Greek cultural influence to penetrate to the heart of Roman society. The conquerors were conquered culturally, adopting the language, arts, and intellectual traditions of those they had defeated militarily. Military historians analysing Pydna have noted its place in the evolution of infantry tactics. The battle represented the culmination of a 200-year period in which the phalanx had been the dominant infantry formation. From Philip II's creation of the sarissa-armed phalanx in 359 BC to Perseus' defeat in 168 BC, this tactical system had shaped Mediterranean warfare. Its eventual defeat by the Roman legion marked a fundamental transition in how infantry warfare would be conducted. The phalanx represented the culmination of one approach to infantry combat, achieving maximum combat power through mass, cohesion, and specialized weapons. Every element was optimized for a specific type of battle. Head-on engagement on suitable terrain where numerical density and weapon reach provided decisive advantage. This approach had proven remarkably effective for 2 centuries, which demonstrated its fundamental soundness. The legion represented a different approach, accepting reduced maximum effectiveness in ideal conditions in exchange for broader effectiveness across varied conditions. A legion could fight effectively in mountains, forests, streets, ships, fortifications, or open plains. It could advance, retreat, wheel, form square, or split into independent units as circumstances required. This flexibility came at a cost. In a direct frontal clash on perfectly level ground against a properly formed phalanx, the legion was probably inferior. But such perfect conditions were rare in actual warfare. The transition from phalanx to legion reflected a broader shift in military thinking that would recur throughout history. Specialized systems optimized for specific conditions would repeatedly be developed, prove highly effective in those conditions, and then fail when faced with enemies who refused to fight on those terms or who exploited the inherent limitations of specialization. The solution was not simply to create a different specialized system. The Macedonian attempts to make a more flexible phalanx by reducing pike length or training smaller formations demonstrated this trap. You could not fix the phalanx weaknesses without eliminating its strengths. The solution was to create a generalized system that accepted good enough performance across all conditions. This required abandoning the pursuit of optimal performance and accepting merely adequate performance as the price of flexibility. For military organizations throughout history, this lesson has proven difficult to internalize. The allure of the perfect weapon, the ideal formation, the unbeatable system has repeatedly led armies to overspecialize and then face defeat when conditions did not match their optimization. The Battle of Pydna should have taught this lesson definitively. The phalanx was perfect in theory, devastatingly effective in practice under the right conditions, and ultimately inferior to a less specialized system that worked adequately under all conditions. Yet this lesson has been repeatedly forgotten and relearned at terrible cost throughout military history. The late Hellenistic kingdoms that survived Pydna faced a dilemma regarding their military systems. The Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, watching Macedonia's destruction, understood that their own phalanx-based army was now obsolete. Yet completely rebuilding their military along Roman lines was economically impossible and politically dangerous. Their solution was essentially to avoid fighting Rome at all costs. Ptolemaic Egypt became a client state, its foreign policy dictated by Rome, its kings ruling at Roman sufferance. When internal disputes threatened the dynasty, they appealed to Rome for support rather than relying on their own military power. This was a humiliating but practical response to the new military reality revealed at Pydna. The Seleucid Empire, larger and more powerful than Egypt, attempted a different approach. They maintained the phalanx but invested heavily in other arms, particularly cavalry and specialized troops. When they fought Rome at Magnesia in 190 BC, before Pydna, their diverse army had been comprehensively defeated by Roman legions using tactics similar to those that would later succeed at Pydna. This defeat had temporarily checked Seleucid power, but the kingdom survived. After Pydna, the Seleucids understood that any future conflict with Rome would end in their destruction. Like Egypt, they became increasingly deferential to Roman power. The smaller Hellenistic states adapted by essentially abandoning their pretensions to military power. Rhodes, Pergamum, the Achaean League, the various Greek cities all recognized that independent military action against Rome was suicidal. They maintained armies sufficient for local security, and for contributing forces to Roman campaigns, but their military establishments were no longer designed for major warfare. This transformation of the Hellenistic world from independent kingdoms to Roman clients or subjects was the ultimate consequence of Pydna. The battle had not just defeated one Macedonian army, it had demonstrated that the entire Hellenistic military system was obsolete. No kingdom relying on that system could resist Rome. The options were submission or destruction. Most chose submission. Within the Roman military establishment, the memory of Pydna influenced tactical thinking for generations. Any time Roman forces encountered pike-armed enemies, the Pydna template was applied. This happened repeatedly as Rome expanded into new regions where pike-armed infantry were common. The Germanic tribes, for example, sometimes employed long spears in dense formations that superficially resembled the phalanx. Roman commanders facing these formations used the same basic approach, proven at Pydna: maneuver to force movement, exploit terrain, strike at gaps and flanks, engage in close combat where the gladius was superior to long spears. The tactics worked with consistent effectiveness. The Dacian wars under Trajan faced enemies using the falx, a long curved blade on a shaft, wielded in formations that created somewhat similar tactical challenges to the phalanx. The Roman solution was again based on Pydna principles. Use missile weapons and light troops to disrupt formation, maneuver to create gaps, engage with heavy infantry once cohesion was lost. By this period, the Roman legion had evolved from the manipular system that fought at Pydna to the cohort-based organization of the Principate, but the fundamental tactical approach remained consistent. Even in the late Roman period, when the legion itself had evolved into a very different formation, the lessons of Pydna remained relevant. The late Roman army faced various enemies employing pike-like weapons, from Germanic spear formations to Persian cavalry with long lances. The tactical responses, while adapted to new circumstances and new Roman military organization, still reflected principles proven on the plains of Pydna over 500 years earlier. The influence of Pydna extended beyond Rome to affect other military cultures that encountered descriptions of the battle. Vegetius, writing his military manual in the 4th or 5th century AD, used the phalanx versus legion comparison to illustrate principles of military organization. His analysis, while not always historically accurate, demonstrated that the battle remained a touchstone for military thinking centuries after the event. Medieval and Renaissance military theorists rediscovering classical military literature found the phalanx versus legion debate fascinating. The pike, which had disappeared from European warfare after the fall of Rome, was reintroduced in the late medieval period. Swiss pike formations in the 14th and 15th centuries created something remarkably similar to the Macedonian phalanx: dense formations of men with long pikes overwhelming enemies through mass and reach. The success of Swiss pikemen sparked extensive debate among military theorists about whether the phalanx system had been vindicated. Some argued that the pike's dominance in contemporary warfare proved the Macedonians had been right all along, that Pydna was an aberration, or that Roman accounts had exaggerated their victory. Others recognized that the Swiss faced different enemies and tactical circumstances than the Macedonians had faced at Pydna. When Spanish tercio formations combined pikemen with arquebusiers in the 16th century, creating a mixed formation that could handle both close combat and firepower, military theorists saw this as analogous to the Roman combination of heavy infantry and light troops that had defeated the phalanx. The tercio's success against pure pike formations seemed to validate the Pydna lesson that flexibility defeats specialization. These comparisons, while historically imprecise, demonstrated the enduring influence of Pydna as a case study in military tactics. The battle had become embedded in Western military thought as the definitive example of how specialized formations could be defeated by more flexible systems. Whether the comparison was always appropriate for different historical contexts was debatable, but the fact that military thinkers continued referencing Pydna 1500 years after the battle testified to its significance in the development of military doctrine. Modern military academies still sometimes teach Pydna as a historical example of the importance of tactical flexibility. The specific weapons and formations are obsolete, but the underlying principles remain relevant. Military organizations must balance specialization against flexibility. They must design their forces to handle likely scenarios while maintaining the ability to adapt to unexpected circumstances. They must avoid becoming so optimized for specific conditions that they become vulnerable when those conditions are not met. The archaeological study of Pydna has been frustrated by the lack of precise location information in ancient sources. Unlike some ancient battlefields where terrain features allow precise reconstruction, Pydna's location is known only generally. Modern historians have debated where exactly the armies clashed, with several proposed locations in the regions south of the ancient city. Excavations in the area have found scattered artifacts consistent with a major battle: bronze pike butts, javelin heads, fragments of armour, but nothing definitive enough to locate the battlefield precisely. This archaeological uncertainty has not prevented detailed analysis of the battle based on ancient sources, terrain analysis, and understanding of the military systems involved. Even without knowing the exact location, military historians can reconstruct the general course of the battle from Plutarch, Livy, and Polybius's accounts. These sources, while written from a Roman perspective and therefore biased in their interpretation, provide sufficient detail about the formations, movements, and tactical developments to understand what happened. The consistency of accounts from multiple sources gives confidence in the general narrative. The phalanx advanced, initially drove back Roman forces, lost cohesion during the advance, was penetrated at gaps in the formation, and collapsed once Romans got inside pike reach. The specifics of casualties, exactly which units fought where, and precise timing remain uncertain. But the tactical dynamics are clear enough to analyse the battle meaningfully. What remains most significant about Pydna is not the specific details of the engagement, but its broader significance in military history. The battle decisively demonstrated that the Macedonian Phalanx, despite its theoretical perfection and 2 centuries of battlefield success, was inferior to the Roman legion when faced by a commander who understood its weaknesses and possessed the tactical tools to exploit them. This was not a matter of one army being braver or better trained. Both forces were professional, well-led, and fighting for their survival. The Macedonians were defending their homeland. The Romans were thousands of miles from home in hostile territory. If courage and motivation determined outcomes, the battle could have gone either way. Instead, the systematic advantages of the legion over the phalanx proved decisive. The Roman tactical system allowed exploitation of terrain, created opportunities to engage on favourable terms, and provided the flexibility to adapt as the battle developed. The Macedonian system, for all its power, lacked the flexibility to respond once its formation was disrupted. Lucius Aemilius Paullus lived only 2 years after his triumph over Macedonia. He died in 160 BC, having never commanded another army after Pydna. His legacy was secured by that single battle. He had defeated the legendary Macedonian Phalanx, destroyed an ancient kingdom, and validated Roman military superiority over the Hellenistic world. In his funeral oration, preserved by Polybius, speakers emphasized his greatest achievement. He had faced the formation that Alexander used to conquer the world, had understood its power and its limitations, and had broken it through tactical skill rather than brute force. The Roman military tradition would remember Paullus as the commander who solved the problem of the phalanx. His name became associated with the principle that superior tactics and flexibility could defeat seemingly invincible specialized forces. Later Roman commanders, facing their own tactical challenges, would invoke his example. Just as Paullus had broken the phalanx at Pydna, they too would find ways to defeat enemies whose systems seemed perfect and invincible. The kingdom of Macedonia never recovered from Pydna. The artificial republics established by Rome proved unstable. When a pretender claiming to be Perseus's son raised a rebellion in 149 BC, Rome responded by eliminating even the fiction of Macedonian autonomy. Macedonia became a Roman province, its government abolished, its military traditions ended, its identity as an independent state erased. The survivors of Pydna, those Macedonians who had been taken captive or had fled the battlefield, dispersed throughout the Mediterranean world. Some were sold as slaves, others found employment as mercenaries or guards, trading on their reputation as trained soldiers. A few wrote accounts of the battle that have not survived but influenced later historians. From these survivors came stories of what it had been like to face the Roman legions, how the confident advance of the phalanx had turned to chaos and then to massacre, how men trained from childhood in the sarissa had been butchered like sheep once Romans got inside their pike reach. These accounts, filtered through multiple retellings, shaped how later generations understood the battle. The phalanx had seemed invincible, its advance terrifying and beautiful, its power overwhelming. Then, almost inexplicably to those experiencing it from inside the formation, it had disintegrated. The order that gave it strength became a trap. The weapons that made it deadly at range became liabilities at close quarters. The discipline that made it effective when formed left individual soldiers helpless when the formation broke. Paullus's words before the battle, recorded by Plutarch, took on prophetic significance. He had seen the Macedonian phalanx in full array and recognized both its terrifying beauty and its ultimate vulnerability. He had understood that Roman victory would be costly but certain. He had grasped that facing the phalanx was not about matching its strength, but about imposing conditions where its strength became irrelevant. That understanding, applied through the systematic tactics Roman commanders employed that day, decided not just the battle but the future of the Mediterranean world. When the last Macedonian phalangite threw down his sarissa and fled the field at Pydna, an era ended. The military system that had defined Hellenistic warfare for 2 centuries, that had conquered from the Balkans to the Indus, that had seemed to represent the ultimate evolution of infantry combat, proved mortal after all. The Roman legion, less elegant, less theoretically perfect, but more practically effective, had crushed it. The sky over Pydna on the evening of June 22nd, 168 BC, was thick with smoke from burning equipment and funeral pyres. The plain was littered with the debris of battle, broken sarissas, shattered shields, abandoned armour, and the bodies of thousands of Macedonian soldiers. The survivors, Roman and Macedonian alike, understood they had witnessed something historically significant. The old order was dead. A new one, built on Roman military supremacy, had been born in blood on that contested ground. The Macedonian phalanx would exist henceforth only in military histories, a formation studied for its past glory rather than feared for its present power. The Roman legion would march on to conquer the known world, carrying with it the lessons learned when 16,000 pike-armed Macedonians discovered that perfection in theory means nothing when your enemy knows how to make you fight on his terms rather than yours,